Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Nuclear for Australia Live. It's my pleasure to be with you tonight. I'll be joined by a series of guests, and the purpose of this live is to be answering your questions on nuclear energy and pushing the message that nuclear energy is a very important part of the energy mix, and the legalisation of nuclear energy is integral for Australia going forward. Currently, nuclear energy is banned in Australia. Nuclear energy uses fission. It's the splitting of atoms that occurs within a nuclear power plant's reactor. All of the nuclear power plants operational within the world today use fission products to produce their power. And the same power plants would be used in Australia if nuclear energy can be legalised. Through the process, in the splitting of an atom, it produces energy, which is used to heat water in this structure, which then produces steam and turns a turbine, similar to how wind produces energy. And the same mechanism of heating water to then turn a turbine is also used in coal. So it's a very known source that's been used in many different other applications. And it's a source that's been used in nuclear for many, many years. It's very reliable. The reactor's core contains these very dense pellets, 7-gram pellets, which contain the same amount of energy as 600 litres of oil, a tonne of coal, and 480 metres of natural gas. This very small part of the reactor, there's many of these pellets to produce the energy. So it's clear here how incredibly dense and powerful nuclear energy is. So nuclear energy isn't just used to produce power that we use in our homes. It's also used in different applications such as research medicine, which the Opal research reactor produces medical isotopes up in Lucas Heights, and nuclear powered vessels such as the submarines which are coming to Australia. Currently, nuclear power is responsible for 10% of our global power, okay? So it's clear that it's applicable worldwide, and that's why we need to lift the ban on nuclear energy in Australia. There is zero emissions from the generation of power in nuclear energy. Its generation of greenhouse emissions is much less than other sources, even when it's considered, even when the mining and production is considered, the greenhouse gas emissions are incredibly low. Some contentious parts that people think of nuclear power is that it takes forever, it's incredibly unsafe, and it's really not. It's been used worldwide for so long. The safety is very misunderstood, as you can see in this graph here. Over half all of the nuclear reactors ever built worldwide have taken less than 6 years to build. And that's why the time is now to unban nuclear power so that we can begin this process of expanding our nuclear capabilities. So I urge you to chuck your questions in the chat of whatever platform you are on. We will be scanning through them, eager to answer any questions that you have. And you can see the QR code that has just popped up on your screens to sign the petition to unban nuclear energy. Okay, so we've got a question here on Facebook. All right, I'm going to have a little look at. Could you explain when and why nuclear was banned in Australia? And I think that's a fantastic question. Nuclear energy was banned in Australia in 1998 as a trade-off for the Lucas Heights reactor that I referenced earlier. So that we could have the capabilities of nuclear medicine. And the trade-off that occurred was some legislation that meant that we're not able to produce nuclear power or have nuclear power plants that are capable of producing power. So currently the reactor that we have is for research and medical isotopes and is not capable of producing power for our grid. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. That's why it was banned. Another question that you can see at the bottom of your screen is nuclear bad for the climate? It's not. Nuclear, alongside renewables, are integral for us reaching our net zero emissions by 2050. If we don't use nuclear, renewables are going to have to be backed up by another power source, such as natural gas. Nuclear produces a constant, reliable baseload power 90% of the time, and is 2 to 3 times more reliable than wind and solar. So, in other parts of the world, nuclear is a part of the energy mix where it produces a constant power load that can then be turned down or up dependent on the fluctuations of the wind and solar. So, say the solar panels aren't bringing as much energy because the sun isn't shining as much, then we can ramp up the nuclear plants in that area to reach our energy targets. But another question that is very commonly asked is, what about the nuclear waste? Worldwide, the nuclear waste ever produced could fit in the MCG. All of the waste that has ever been produced by nuclear power could fit in the MCG, all right? It is so dense. You saw the 7-gram pellets, okay, in some of the pictures that we had previously. They're about this big. There's many of those in a reactor, granted. But after 5 years in a reactor, 92% of the energy in those pellets still remains. Okay, so all of the high level waste, I'll just correct myself in my previous statement, all the high level waste ever produced, which is the really radioactive material, could fit in the MCJ. But it's important to note that it's not as radioactive as some people think. In fact, living next to a nuclear power plant for an entire year gives you less radiation than you would receive from eating a banana. So I received more radiation this morning with breakfast than I would have living next to a nuclear power plant for a whole year. And back to my note before, so these very small, dense pellets still contain 92% of their potential energy after 5 years in a reactor, after they're considered wasted. So with very responsible recycling, we can then reuse these pellets and continue to gain the energy which they contain. And a very good point in a YouTube comment. If you've ever lived near a nuclear power plant, you would get the same amount of radiation per year as flying from Sydney to Melbourne and back. This is the point that I brought up in one of my speeches you might have seen on the Nuclear for Australia TikTok account. You would get more radiation going through airport security, especially because of the scanning devices that they use, than you would living next to a nuclear power plant. In a minute, I am going to be joined by one of my special guests. His name is Eduardo. He is a very keen advocate who lives in Italy. He joins me now. He runs a page called Giovanni Blue on Instagram. There's no nuclear currently in Australia, but the government is working towards it. And he was at the recent New York event where the major banks of the world joined and pledged to support nuclear. So, hello. It's great.
Hi, Seth. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure, and I'm happy to be here sharing a few viewpoints on Italy and on the New York events.
Well, it's great to have you join us. I'll just ask you about the New York event. What happened? Can you give us a brief rundown of what you saw and what went down?
Yeah, of course. So, as you know, after COP28, more than 20 countries pledged to triple nuclear energy installed capacity by 2050. And that's a huge deal. But of course, this needs financing. So the New York event was all about banks getting together with utilities, with the nuclear industry in general, and, focusing on how do we manage, how do we finance this huge thing that is tripling nuclear energy capacity by 2050, which, 2050 is just a few days ahead. So the main thing that emerged from this meeting, because it was going to be very interesting because it has never happened before. Banks are very new to the nuclear sector, and in fact, what emerged is that banks just don't really know how to do it. A guy from James Schaffer from Guggenheim Securities, which is one of the most important financial institutions in the world, said this very, very powerful phrase that I remember, I stick in my mind, says, financing nuclear is putting the most complex and innovative industry on the planet, which is nuclear, together with the most conservative and entities that there are in the world, which are banks. So we need to put together these two things. And as you can see, this is going to be quite a difficult deal to have. We had the banks said different things. The financial institution underlined diverse kind of issues. But one of the most important thing that emerged from this meeting in New York was that basically we lack knowledge on nuclear. Banks lack of basic knowledge on how the nuclear industry works. So banks, which as I said, are very, very keen on being careful on where to allocate risk. They're very careful on risk. They're a huge financial institution, so they want to spend their money well. And they're very scared of this enormous risk with the nuclear industry. And they don't really know how to operate in the sector. If you consider, for example, I'm from Europe, so I can give you an example on that. The EU taxonomy was launched in 2020, so it's 4 years old. Okay, and nuclear was included in the EU taxonomy just 4 years, just in 2020. So it's totally new in Europe. It's totally new in the US, and we really lack a basic knowledge. Banks lack of basic knowledge on the topic. Also, what they said is that they don't only lack of basic knowledge on the topic, but also they lack of personnel, or specialized personnel that can help them guide through the nuclear industry, the nuclear business. And that's an immense thing, really. It has never happened before. And we have this enormous thing of tripling nuclear by 2050. So if you put together all these things, we don't have a lot of time. There's huge energy demand that is going to spike in a few years, given by, for example, data centers and all the things that is driving the energy demand. And so if you put together these factors, really, it's going to be difficult. That's what basically banks said. It's basically a huge football game. It's a football game that everyone wants to play. You have utilities, you have banks, you have governments, and there's a huge wall in the middle of the football field, which is made by commercial, financial, and regulatory problems. So it's like a huge football game that everyone wants to play, but with large wall in the middle. That's basically what emerged.
Yeah, well, thanks for giving me the rundown there. And I want to highlight a specific point that you brought up. Banks are the most conservative sort of entity. They're very careful about any risk that they undertake. And the fact that these huge banks globally have pledged to nuclear is just such a big thing. Do you agree?
I do agree. I do agree a lot. It is very important for banks to work closely with governments so they can be guided on a good path for financing nuclear. Because as I said, they're very new to this sector, and the focus on the event was really onto how to better allocate risk together, working together with governments and regulatory entities. I would like to share you one thing with you that it really is the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of the New York climate event. Do you know the Spider-Man meme? You know, when there are three Spider-Mans that point at each other, it's like, who is that? And imagine the same meme. One Spider-Man is the government, are the governments. One Spider-Man are the utilities, and one government and one Spider-Man are the banks. And they point at each other and they say, hey, the banks say to the government, I'm not gonna finance the huge project if you're not gonna supply me with subsidies and loans and a stable bipartisan support for the next 20 years. And then there's government which say, hey, referring to the banks, okay, I'm not gonna give you subsidies and stuff if I'm not sure that you're gonna help me through the build, financing the thing. For sure, we're not gonna leave the project if something goes wrong. And then you have utilities which are like in the middle and which say to the bank, guys, we're gonna put engineering into this, we are going to put our efforts into this, but we need both government support and financial support from bank, otherwise we're not going to do this. So it's really a Spider-Man meme kind of game. And in the middle of this triad, we have the regulatory commission. For America is the NRC, for Europe is we have Euratom and a lot more things. In Asia there's another one. So, and in the middle you have these regulatory entities which like look at each other and don't really know what to do. So it's a mess. And we don't have a lot of time. So it's a new sector, really. It's a new business, and banks needs to just develop knowledge on that.
Definitely. It's a proven technology, but working together, all those entities as a team to produce it is something that we definitely need to work on globally. I just want to ask you about Italy's move back to nuclear. What is that looking like?
That's a great question. Actually, I don't know because it's kind. No, okay, just kidding. It's kind of difficult with Italy. It's Italy is a very complicated country by itself. So what is happening in Italy from what I know, from my understanding, basically what we are doing is very silently, very stealthy. Imagine us as a silent nuclear submarine going underwater. We are working on building the regulatory framework for nuclear, for reintroduced nuclear. So what our ministry is doing right now is building the basic, the agency that regulates nuclear, the safety of nuclear, how to deal with the waste and everything. We are basically shaping what this new agency will be in the future, and we are rebuilding the base, the framework. Basically, we're working on bureaucracy. That's what we are doing. So do not expect this government to start build on nuclear. We are not, unfortunately, gonna build nuclear because simply we lack the basic bureaucracy, the basic framework, regulatory framework for that. But we are working on that, and that's very good because that's exactly what we need to work in before actually, announcing new bills and stuff. So as I said this at COP2. Will for sure remembers. I said Italy was a nuclear country, is a nuclear country, and will be a nuclear nation, even if we don't really know it. So that's the point in Italy right now.
It's fantastic that you guys are making the steps to go towards nuclear energy. That's fantastic. I just want to guide a specific question that we had on Facebook to you. Is it true that nuclear is far less weighted material than coal over 5 years of use? Or does it take more volume of coal to produce the same power?
Well, nuclear is the most energy dense source we have on the planet. 1 kilogram of nuclear contains many more millions joules of energy per volume compared to coal, gas, and everything else. If we were to make a graph, and on a small scale but realistic scale like this, we will have gas like this, we'll have coal, and then uranium will be in the stratosphere right now. So if you look at the energy density of uranium, the end of the column will reach stratosphere. So of course, there's actually absolutely no comparison between gas, coal, and nuclear, and that's a great thing also because of land footprint. Land footprint is a huge deal. It's a huge thing, especially
Definitely.
in countries like Italy, which Australia is a huge country. We do not have all the space. So for us, nuclear reactors like AP1000, EPRs, APR 1400 would be extremely powerful tool for us, because really will help us achieve decarbonization without using, covering the half of the country with solar panels. And one thing I would like to say about coal, this is very interesting, almost no one knows this. Coal power plants emits much more radiation than nuclear power plants do. When you burn coal, you release ashes which are radioactive. Of course, the least problem you'll have with coal ashes is the radiation that would be, that cause cancer and stuff. But coal power plants emits 3 to 10 times more radiation in the environment compared to nuclear plants. So as you said before,
Yes.
while you were doing the explanation, so really no comparison.
Yes, definitely. Look, I'd like to thank you for your explanations, especially that point. I'll give you a very quick, specific fact. So hydrocarbons, this from AEST, our own nuclear agency. The combustion of hydrocarbons produces 9.2 electrovolts of energy, and nuclear fission of uranium produces 177 million electrovolts of energy. So that comparison is clear.
Orders of magnitude.
Orders of magnitude.
Yes.
I want to thank you for joining us tonight. We've got a special guest coming up next. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Eduardo, and your viewpoint from Italy. This is a global effort to bring nuclear to the forefront of our energy mixes. Now, Jasmine is a nuclear security expert. She has a Masters of Nuclear Energy from University of New South Wales and is the Australian Managing Director of Global Nuclear Security Partners and the President of Women in Nuclear Australia. She lives in Perth and is a member of our organisation's expert group. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Hey, Seth, how you going?
Hi, it's great to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. And let's chat nuclear.
Yes, let's chat nuclear. Let's have a look at some of the questions here. What about the nuclear waste? Is that a question that you can answer?
Yeah. So the nuclear industry is probably the only industry in the energy sector that actually manages its waste from woe to go. So before a power plant is even commissioned, there needs to be a plan for its waste. That waste is classified as low-level waste, intermediate-level waste, or high-level waste. The majority of waste that comes out of a power reactor is low-level waste. You're thinking about things like gloves, rags that are used to repair things around the reactor core. That stuff can get bundled up, and each year a power plant will produce maybe a shipping container's worth of that kind of waste. That waste can be isolated and disposed of, and it only has a short half-life, so it becomes regular old landfill after a few years. Intermediate level waste, that's waste that has a longer half-life. It needs to be packaged up and disposed of in a facility that's purpose-built and designed for long-term storage and disposal. High-level waste is the stuff people are really worried about. That is what we call the used fuel. That's really hot materials, lanthanides and actinides. So if you remember your periodic table from high school, the two long lines at the bottom of the periodic table that have really long, weird names, those are the things that last for quite a long time. That stuff gets disposed of by being put in a dry storage cask after it's been cooled for a long period of time. It can either then be recycled, and the majority of that spent fuel or used fuel can be returned to other fuel types. The stuff that can't be recycled gets stored away in a deep geological repository. That is world's best practice, and Finland is doing that as we speak. They're the first country to have a licensed deep geological repository for high-level waste. But that's only a small amount of waste that power plant produces.
Yeah, definitely. And people don't know that nuclear is one of the only energy sources that actually stores their waste on site. Most of their waste is stored on site in those secure casks. I just wanted to ask you about nuclear security. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so nuclear security is a field of its own. It's something I've specialised in. I'm also a mum and I'm getting yelled at because it's dinner time. So excuse me for that. But nuclear security is about how do we protect people and the environment from the harmful effects of nuclear materials that are being done by malicious actors. So this is making sure that materials are being stored securely, that they are being transported securely, so that material is only being used for what it's designed to be used. And so I work with operators and regulators to make sure that the security practices are things that deter malicious actors from wanting to get their hands on nuclear security. And this is a global effort, right? Material is used globally, and we try to stop it from being used globally.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to guide you to a question that we received on YouTube. Australia developed uranium enrichment in the 1980s. Should we resurrect this technology to enhance our nuclear security or nuclear materials to avoid weapons proliferation?
Oh, I love this question, and I saw it pop through, and I'm like, I hope Seth asked me this one because I like it.
Fantastic.
So yes, Australia does have a history of developing enrichment technologies. There's actually one that's currently in use out of the US. It is an Australian technology called Silex, developed out at ANSTO at Lucas Heights. But because it's illegal to enrich uranium in Australia, they've actually taken their operations over to the US. Now, I am a true believer that Australia as a nuclear nation could own the entire nuclear fuel cycle, and the process of enriching uranium and fuel fabrication could allow us to make sure that material is only being used for power generation and not for weapons purposes. So I completely agree with that question. Yes, if we did our enrichment here, we could create fuels that had uranium enrichment levels that were only high enough for plant use, so that we're reducing the amount of high enriched uranium that is out there that potentially could be used by malicious actors for weapons. So I definitely think that is an option, and that's one that I really like.
Yeah, wonderful. I wanted to ask you, do you know anything about fast reactors and how the waste can be used as fuel?
So fast reactors are working in the Generation 4 space. So there's some of the more advanced reactor designs that are out there. And I know you're going to have Mark join your chat soon, and he'll have a lot more on that than I do. But because those fast reactors are wanting reactions, they're having constant reactions going. Some of those highly energized elements that are left in used fuel can be burnt up as part of that energy to produce the reactor. So I'll let Mark probably answer that in a more nuanced way rather than me butchering it.
No, thank you for your answer. Anyways, I just want to ask you about ANSTO. What is their responsibility with nuclear in Australia?
Yes, so the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, ANSTO, based out of Lucas Heights in Sydney. So they're about 30 odd Ks out of the Sydney CBD. So they have been around for over 70 years. They've had a few research reactors on site there. They've recently decommissioned the HIFAR reactor, which was a high flux research reactor. But their current operational reactor is called the Opal. It is an open pool light water reactor. What it does, besides having the most beautiful reactor pool, this bright, beautiful blue that you can get on their website, what they do is they produce the bulk of Australia's nuclear medicine isotopes. So if anyone you know has had a cancer therapy that's involved nuclear medicine, or if you've had a nuclear medicine scan, those isotopes have likely been created out at ANSTO. They also dope silicon in the reactor. So high performance electronics, think things like really powerful computers and quantum computers require super, super pure silicon that's been doped in a reactor. And ANSTO produces about 70% of the world's high-end electronic silicon. But they also produce a heap of neutrons. And those neutrons, which normally in a nuclear power plant would be used to create heat and generate power, in this instance, these neutrons aren't thermal neutrons and they're not working on heat. They're neutrons that can be directed down beam lines and be used in research. And so hundreds of researchers every year flock to ANSTO to do their experiments, to be able to test what happens to different materials. They'll go there and they'll use those neutrons in their research work. And if you live around Sydney, you can go visit ANSTO. They have a discovery centre there. They do tours. You can jump on their website and book in a tour. And I highly recommend it because it is a pretty cool place to see how nuclear science works and what they do to protect the environment and understand a lot of nuclear technologies.
Wonderful, thank you. Every time nuclear safety and security is brought up, the examples of Fukushima and Chernobyl are given. Can you give me sort of a cap on why those arguments aren't necessarily very strong?
Yeah, so Chernobyl, pretty horrific nuclear accident. And this is a tale about a Russian reactor designed in the 60s that was pushed to its limits by a nuclear engineer and who also overrode a heap of those safety systems. And what happens if you push nuclear material to its limits? It will melt down. And that's what we saw in Chernobyl. And noting it was in the 80s during the height of the Cold War where Russia was very locked down. It had taken the Western world a long time to realise what had actually gone wrong in that accident. The first responders on that site, a fair few of them died directly from radiation exposure. And there have been cases of increased cancers in that area due to the high levels of radiation from a meltdown. Fukushima, very different scenario. So you've got an earthquake and a tsunami that damages a heap of the emergency generators on site, which means that you can't cool the reactor down, which you need to do when the reactor's in shutdown. But in this case, nobody is killed by radiation. The team on site there were able to manage and bring those reactors into a safe mode, even though there were some hydrogen explosions and some of the emergency systems were damaged by the earthquake and tsunami. That nobody has died from harmful effects of radiation in doing that. The Japanese TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, are decommissioning those plants safely and ensuring that they can return that site the way it needs to be. And so two very, very different accidents. We learn a lot from other people in the nuclear industry. That's why we're very transparent and share amongst operators what goes on, because that's how we make sure that we're doing things safely as an industry. And that's two big accidents, but that's over a span of over 70 years. And I think that that's pretty good compared to a lot of other energy sources.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you very much, Jazz, for joining us tonight and giving us an insight into safety and security and storage of nuclear waste. So thank you very much. All right, our next guest has a huge biography. He holds a bachelor in nuclear engineering technology and masters in cybersecurity from Thomas Edison State University. He has decades of nuclear power experience and engineering experience. He was in the United States Navy and currently lives in Virginia. He's moving to Australia soon. Hi, Mark. It's nice to meet you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Can you tell us about your professional experience in the field of nuclear?
So as you mentioned, I have decades of experience. I did 20 years in the U.S. Navy as an operator. You can see the submarine behind me. That was my last vessel that I served on, the USS Washington. That's one of those Virginia-class submarines that are part of the AUKUS Pillar 1 program. After I retired from the Navy, I did 3 years working for Dominion Energy. I have my little book that I carry with me every day when I worked for Dominion Energy. I was an operator out there. So I have been the guy that was out there operating. So Jazz was talking about Fukushima. So had a meltdown occurred or some incident that would occur, I was the guy running into the radiation field. So I understand and have experienced radiation. In my career, 23 years in the nuclear industry, I've received about 0.01 sieverts of radiation. 1 rem is what we would use in the United States. We use rem more than sieverts, but that's about 4 years worth of radiation, and that's over 23 years. So 4 years worth of natural radiation.
Yeah, so it's clear that someone as experienced in the field doesn't get exposed to as much radiation as people might think. So I just want to guide you to, we've got heaps of questions flowing in. One from, here we go, YouTube. He would love to know how fast reactors use the waste and what the end waste type is. We had a little bit of a chat about this with Jazz.
Yeah, so Jazz mentioned thermal. So when neutrons are emitted from an atom, they come out at fast speed, right? We call them fast speed, and then we bring them down to thermal. So all the pressurized water reactors are thermal reactors because it brings the energy down. A fast reactor, which are your plutonium reactors. So when I take your uranium-38 atom and it gets a neutron, it becomes into plutonium. And that uses fast neutrons, not thermal neutrons. And so fast reactors are just able to consume plutonium and uranium-233, some other of those heavier elements. The ones that are not natural, I say not natural, meaning that they are generated in nuclear processes, but nuclear is natural. I saw the great comment about the swords. Those are from my military career, by the way. So one is the chief sword. I was a chief petty officer, and the other is my officer sword. So
fantastic. Yeah, I love the collection as well. I love collecting military memorabilia, so it's awesome seeing your collection back there. I want to guide you to another question. Should we consider CANDU reactors? Can you tell us about what CANDU reactors are?
So CANDU reactors, Jazz was talking about enrichment processes. So CANDU reactors use heavy water. So natural water is H2O. We call it D2O. That hydrogen atom is normally your hydrogen atom is just a proton. Deuterium, which is where the D comes from, is just a proton and a neutron to it. So it's called heavy water because it's heavier, about twice the weight of twice the mass of regular hydrogen. So it keeps neutron population really well. So you can just use natural uranium. You don't have to enrich it. So that is a process that you can use. So it's an easier process from a manufacturing of your fuel cycle. It does require online refueling. There are some challenges that are associated with it. So should the Canadians have exported that capability to India, so it is a well understood technology. Canada is part of the overall Commonwealth of the British of Great Britain, so you have access to that information. Shouldn't be difficult. They have decades and decades of experience of them. The other thing is that because you can online refuel them, you're not stuck with your fuel cycle running out, so you can actually plan your outages based around ideal times instead of when your fuel is going to be consumed during that fuel cycle.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So you live in Virginia in the United States. I want to ask you about what's the nuclear industry like there? Is there a lot of reactors?
So I live where there are more reactors than anywhere on planet Earth. So I live in southeastern Virginia. So I'm about an hour and a half north of where the Wright brothers did their first flight in Norfolk, Chesapeake, Newport News area. So we have two giant commercial reactors at Surrey Power Station. That's where I worked when I worked for Dominion Energy. And then we have Newport News Shipbuilding, which builds all the United States Navy's aircraft carriers and half their submarines. And then we also have Norfolk Naval Shipyard, where they do a lot of the nuclear repair work, overhauls of submarines, large maintenance availabilities and aircraft carriers. Is the home of the entire East Coast aircraft carrier fleet for the U.S. and then Submarine Squadron 8. So we've got 8 submarines there, and then half of the aircraft carrier fleet. So we've got anywhere between 20 and 25 reactors here at any given point in time.
Wow, that is a lot. Very interesting. I want to ask you about this question here. What is nuclear's role in aviation as an end user?
So aviation, that's an interesting one. So the U.S. Air Force actually in the 50s had an aviation nuclear power program. It actually created the molten salt reactor experiment. So it was part of this, it developed, which is now a Gen 4. We hear the Gen 4 terminology. It's the basis for what will become the molten salt reactor design. Several companies are using that basis. But from an aviation perspective, it is kind of a challenge. And the Air Force program kind of went into it knowing it was going to fail. Molten salt reactors are very safe from a nuclear perspective, but planes falling out of the sky and crashing right due to some other error, I don't necessarily want to put a nuclear reactor, as safe as they are, right? I wouldn't want a nuclear powered engine, say, to crash in the middle of a population zone. So I don't think we'll see aviation as an end user for it. But when you're looking at like carbon capture technologies, if I use nuclear reactors as the energy input to extract the CO2 out of the air to make your fuel, it can become aviation fuel. That's where I see the partnership between aviation and nuclear.
Definitely, and it's a very interesting application for nuclear that not many people might think about. I want to ask you about nuclear, its responsibility in the US. Is it seeing a resurgence? Is it coming back? More reactors being built?
So we just put a new reactor on the grid this year, Vogtle Unit 4, which makes the Vogtle Power Station the largest power station in the U.S. My friend Tim Eccles, the energy director for the state of Georgia, will love that. The U.S. just broke ground on a mobile reactor for the Department of Defense, so that's a new thing that they're working on. So the U.S. were slow to build with our commercial industry. The U.S. did sign the partnership to triple nuclear energy with a bunch of other countries, so that is a big one. But we are constantly, we're restarting TMI Unit 1, so that's 3 Mile Island for TMI, if you don't know. They're working on restarting Palisades, so a bunch of our shuttered reactors are being brought online. License extensions are occurring all throughout the U.S. Surrey Units 1 and 2 have now been had their license extended. They're now going to be 80. You're building a nuclear reactor, you're getting somewhere between 40 and 150 years, I think, is where they're estimating that some of these reactors will finally get decommissioned. Compare that to solar panels that last between 10 to 20 years. Solar panel, you're only replacing small components periodically throughout a nuclear reactor's lifestyle. You don't actually replace the whole reactor every time like you would a solar panel or a wind turbine.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us again tonight. I think the US is clearly a great demonstrator for bringing back nuclear and continuing the efforts to use it as a part of our energy system. I also want to thank you for joining our expert group, and I hope to hear more from you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. So we've got another guest coming up. Her name is Sylvie, and she joins us from France. Excuse the pronunciation, I'm not even going to try. Near Nice in the southeast part of France. Can you pronounce the Nice? Okay, look, I'm not the French expert. Thank you. Can you tell us about where you're staying, about nuclear in France? It's a very big thing over there.
Yep. So right now, I don't know how well you can see. I tried to get the chateau in the background, but I'm staying at a place called Cagnes-sur-Mer, and it's in the southeast region of France. And it's absolutely beautiful. It's spring at the moment, so we've had some really, really good weather. In terms of nuclear in France, I mean, I could start anywhere. It's it's world leading in terms of nuclear. 80% of the domestic energy production in France is nuclear. So obviously, you know, it's quite impressive. They kind of went ridiculous in the 80s in terms of nuclear. But yeah, it's been really amazing. I haven't been able to see any nuclear power plants because the closest one from where I'm staying is the Tricastin one, which is about 2 hours drive away. And it wasn't particularly on the family holiday agenda to visit a nuclear power plant, which was utterly devastating. But yeah, it's amazing where I am right now.
Yeah, France is definitely such a beautiful place. And it's example of its rollout of 56 reactors in just 15 years under the Mesmer plan is absolutely fantastic. Sylvie is also a member of the Students for Nuclear with me, which is a part of the Nuclear for Australia organisation. I want to ask you about what you want to do in the nuclear field when you get older after finishing being a student.
Yeah, it's been kind of a little dream of mine. We had a project in year 4, I remember. And I don't remember the exact parameters around it, but I ended up looking into nuclear. And I remember I was completely inspired. I thought it was a scientific miracle that we could use Einstein's equation and we could create massive amounts of energy from really small amounts of matter. And I remember thinking that was incredible in terms of energy being a really quintessential part of society. And, you know, historically it's a pattern where there's cheap energy, you know, we get prosperous nations. And I wanted to work in an area where there could be a really direct correlation between improving society on a whole. And I thought energy was sort of the place there. And in terms of nuclear energy, I'm really passionate about maths and science. And I think there's a really interesting correlation there, the types of maths and science that you can get into. In terms of what I want to do, honestly, staying in France has made me realize how much I love France. And I'm studying French at school. So I think in being able to investigate some of what France is doing in terms of its nuclear energy sector, being able to do a bit of that outside of school would be really, really amazing. But in terms of what strictly my pathway outside of school, I think it'll depend a lot on Australia's upcoming approach, especially in the upcoming federal elections, the new policies that they're going to take around nuclear. But yeah, me staying in Australia outside of school, because I'm in year 11 right now, I think that'll depend a lot on where Australia decides to, you know, place its trajectory.
Definitely. And France is beautiful, but let's hope that we can keep you in Australia as a part of our nuclear industry.
Yeah.
So France's widespread use of nuclear energy led its prices to be 17% below the EU average. Can you tell us about France's widespread use of nuclear energy compared to Germany's decommissioning of their plants?
Yeah, it's honestly, I love the France versus Germany case study. I think there's honestly there's no real better case study for the merits of nuclear power than these two neighboring European nations, you know, powerhouses of Europe, that took completely different trajectories in the 1980s. And you look at where they've gone comparatively. So yeah, obviously, Germany's phased out its nuclear power. They did that. They finalized that last year, I believe. And if you look at, obviously, we go back a few years, the energy situations between France and Germany were so starkly different. France is Europe's biggest electricity exporter because it routinely has a surplus of electricity due to its high nuclear proportion. Germany, on the other hand, Germany's got a very, it's transitioning very ambitiously to a very renewable energy portfolio mix. And it's, especially when the Russia-Ukraine war began, it became very obvious Germany's fallibility, especially in terms of its high reliance, because it's Europe's manufacturing powerhouse. Obviously, massive amounts of electricity being used in Germany. And it was using natural gas as this sort of transition energy method. And Russia, times were good, natural gas prices were down, pipelines were stable. And then obviously that over-reliance on natural gas became quite apparent when Russia started responding to the sanctions against it by depriving natural gas. And then obviously there was the pipeline bust, which was quite unfortunate in terms of Germany's energy security. But yeah, it's quite interesting to see those two nations. France obviously still uses natural gas, but in terms of electricity, in terms of being warm in the winter, France was quite stable there and was actually exporting electricity to Germany, whereas Germany, intermittency problems from renewables, plus the instability from the natural gas left Germany in quite a precarious place. So in terms of the merits for nuclear power, I think that comparison portrays it quite nicely.
Yes, it's a fantastic comparison being so close in the world. And it's quite ironic that France is the second largest electricity supplier to Germany through its widespread use of nuclear. So yes, it's very interesting. I want to ask for your perspective as a young person in Australia. What do you think the views are on nuclear energy? Are young Australians generally supportive of it, or are they against it?
I can only speak from my environment, but generally young people are very concerned about the environment. We obviously understand the growing urgency to address the climate change problem. But again, there is sort of this resounding sense of, why should our generation have to suffer for it as well? Why should we have to suffer or have a lower standard of living in order to rectify the accumulating problems that have come from generations before us? And I think in terms of that, nuclear power is becoming a more and more prominent way to result to a viable solution in response to these new environmental problems that didn't really exist as prominently before. But in a way that we don't have to sacrifice our standard of living to deal with a energy portfolio mix that's only renewables that are intermittent. And so I think as a young person in Australia, my peers are quite in support of nuclear power, and we have quite, and we're certainly not blind to the unique problems prompted by renewables. And I think we're certainly not of the belief that it's a fairy tale that we can all just switch to renewables, or that there's some fairy tale solution. And I think it's what makes nuclear power so appealing, is that it combines that environmental aspect, but also in a way that we don't have to completely sacrifice our standard of living or worry about being cold in the winter and that sort of thing.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for your perspective on that and answering our questions. I know you've got to duck off to the airport to return to Australia soon. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Well,
I think generally as young people in Australia, I know my classes have definitely gotten around nuclear and are very supportive of it. I've done it for my research project and some of my English tasks to inform and persuade, just because I know so much about it, so I may as well write about it. And the perspectives that I've heard from the young people of Australia is that it's generally accepted. I had a comment from one of my English teachers who was reading my draft and went, I can see, like, what are the downsides? There's so many upsides. What are the downsides? And I said none. All of the downsides which are given have very large explanations or arguments against them. And it's clear that nuclear obviously has some limitations as per every energy source, but it's a fantastic baseload power source that needs to be used in Australia. So again, our QR code has reappeared. Sign the petition for the legalisation of nuclear power in Australia. I want to have a look at one of the questions we got before. It says nuclear fission plants are all outdated and will shut down in the next 20 years. I'm not exactly sure where the source for that has come from. I think fact checking, especially in the field of nuclear energy, when there's so much mis and disinformation surrounding it, is incredibly important. I don't believe that that statement is true to any extent. As Mark said before, the lifespan of nuclear power plants is well above 5 decades, 50, 60, 80, even 120 years, Mark gave the figure. So I think it's very important that we look at our sources, and nuclear power plants are known to be a power source which can last for a very, very long time. I want to talk about COP28. In this event, 25 countries plan to triple nuclear by 2050. So it's clear globally that nuclear is widespread use. It's used worldwide. It's clear that Australia needs to join up with our partner countries. We go to all of these meetings and we're left out as, one of the very few non-nuclear countries. And it's a bit disappointing. So again, look at our petition here and please join the effort to legalise nuclear energy in Australia. Let's have a look at another question. Can you tell us how nuclear has kept up with new technology, as an example, electronics over the same time? Well, as we had a talk about before, the example with Jazz of Chernobyl, the technologies have developed tremendously because nuclear energy can be incredibly dangerous. The reasons behind it developing the energy, developing in its safety and in its technology, it has continually developed from especially Chernobyl. So it's kept up with the times because it's very important to keep that energy source safe and to keep it as powerful as nuclear is capable of. Let's have a look at some more questions here. So I've got a question here about nuclear power plants making low-level waste in Australia already, which we know how to handle. But power plants make high-level radioactive waste that will have to be hauled by trucks through our streets, which is most definitely not true. High-level waste can be vitrified, stored within ceramic material, glass, and concrete, and is stored generally on site. And as Jazz gave the example before, in Finland, they're using deep geological repositories. They find very stable geological areas, which they can put the waste under the ground so that it can then be stored there, keeping it away from the ground. Okay, so it's their way of saving space and storing it underground. And especially in Australia, how we are so geologically stable, we're not near any tectonic plates meeting. And some of the examples of earthquakes given are just puny. Many other places in the world handle much bigger earthquakes with no problem. So let's look at some more questions here. Do you think Australia will have nuclear? I hope so. I hope so. I think the arguments for it are so vast, especially with this push from Nuclear for Australia and your support. I think that nuclear in Australia has a very large role to play. Watch nuclear now for examples of nuclear power used in the 21st century. That's a very good example. Let's look at some more questions here. I think it's important to point out, as I did before, just how much energy is within nuclear. If I've got some specific examples here of especially how much land is used by nuclear. So the land used to produce 26 terawatt hours annually of power for wind is 1,010 kilometers squared. For solar is 607 kilometers squared. And for nuclear, it is just 6.5. Nuclear is the most energy dense power system that we have. It is incredibly important that you sign this petition and we work towards the legalization of nuclear energy so that we can have it a part of Australia's energy mix. We've got another question here. Is nuclear energy reliable? As I said at the start of this live stream, nuclear energy is 2 to 3 times more reliable than wind and solar. It produces baseload power 90% of the time because it's through these chemical reactions that are occurring that it can gain its energy. It's not relying on the sun or wind or these intermittent power sources or the water in hydro's case. It's relying on chemical reactions which occur naturally all of the time. So it is an incredibly reliable power source. Have some more questions here. Our future depends on nuclear. I think that's a fantastic statement. It really does. With Australia moving to try and get renewable energies at our forefront to have zero emissions by 2050, I think is an unachievable target because renewables need fossil fuel backups, because without baseload power, the fluctuations will not be able to power our entire country. I would like to thank all of you for joining us tonight. It's been fantastic to hop on here. How do we sign the petition? This QR code here on the social media that you are on, there is probably a link in the bio somewhere, but scan this QR code and have a look at the links for Nuclear for Australia website and just enter in some simple information and click sign the petition. Look, I want to thank you guys for joining me tonight. I want to thank all of our special guests for joining me tonight. It's been fantastic to have so many different perspectives and opinions and to be able to share this information with all of you. I hope that by the end of this stream, you have gained a deeper understanding of nuclear and why it's so incredibly important that we have it legalized in Australia so that it can be a part of our energy mix. We are going to be doing longer webinars, Nuclear for Australia. There'll be more information about that coming out very soon. But again, I urge you to sign our petition to be informed about nuclear energy. And again, I thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Nuclear energy is illegal to generate in Australia. It has been since 1998, but I believe that this decision has cost our entire nation significant global investments and scientific collaborations on nuclear technologies. Australia has the world's largest uranium resources. 1/3 of the entire world's uranium is held here in Australia. Currently in South Australia, with the amount of uranium we already mine and already export, we could power our state and the rest of the nation. In South Australia, most of our energy comes from solar and wind, which is a good thing, but this requires more land and resources than nuclear. In comparison, nuclear power requires just 1% of the land of solar. It is also much less materials intense. Nuclear waste isn't poorly managed, and the health effects are incredibly misunderstood. You'll experience more radiation going through airport security, as I did earlier today, than you would by standing next to securely stored nuclear waste. Nuclear fission isn't an unobtainable idea. Throughout the world, in 2015, 11% of all global power came from nuclear power. And in France, its widespread use of nuclear power led prices to be 17% below the EU average. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that this clearly demonstrates that nuclear power can and should be implemented in South Australia. Without utilising nuclear power, we are fighting climate change.
Imagine if you only woke up 30% of the time, or only went to school on every third day. That's what it's like being a solar panel or a wind turbine. Some days you work and some days you don't. However, the reality is that we need power 24/7, and that's what nuclear can provide. It's 3 times as reliable as solar and wind, and can provide power over 90% of the time, which is
Here's 5 facts in 20 seconds you probably didn't know about nuclear waste. Number 1, there's 3 types: low, intermediate and high. Number 2, Australia currently manages low and intermediate waste. Number 3, high-level waste, also known as used fuel, isn't green liquid, it's literally just solid grey fuel assemblies. Number 4, the fuel can be stored in dry casks, which expose you to less radiation than airport security. Number 5, used fuel can be recycled, which is where 10% of France's
in Australia, nuclear is banned at multiple levels. Is why I don't think it makes sense is because we don't have the privilege to cherry pick what we want, because in the end, we don't have any backup plan to manage those energy challenges. So what I mean is, if we cherry pick that, okay, let's go for 100% renewables, and that's it. Like, there's no other energy option that we want to consider except for gas peaking plant, which has higher carbon emission. If that 100% renewable energy plan does not work, what is our plan? What is our next plan? And we can't really go back that, oh, we might have to consider nuclear. For me, it's too late. That's why it's very important that we need to do the prep work right now, so that if our plan A does not work, we have something in the background.
The sun might be shining now, but it might not be out tomorrow. That's why we need to unban nuclear energy so that we have a constant baseload of power for our grid system. Nuclear is 3 times more reliable than renewables. It is also